I'll have the honor of presiding over this panel, where we'll deal with what's going on right now. I'd like to emphasize the happy coincidence of the fact that the bill is on the verge of being passed, as I expect, with no vetoes. And at the same time, we have this event going on, which is justice being served, because we have been working as a catalyst for that for the past 9 years. So we have been working to build a way to protect personal data and to protect privacy in Brazil. So we expect that President Temer, our president of our republic, we expect him to be able to recognize the large level of consensus that has been formed around this topic, and that after 9 years of debate, 9 years of public consultations with intense participation from the civil society and also the participation of the private sector, governmental agencies, and we now are waiting and we'll know within the next few days if we, Brazilian citizens, will be, just as other citizens around the world in Europe, Latin America, and other countries, people who already have the law in place, if we'll have the same level of protection for privacy and data protection. We've seen a lot of debates going on in the previous panels. And of course, we need to be assured of the right use of algorithms, of data treatment, data processing. And if the law, if approved, will help us in that regard. And as Professor Fernandez said earlier in the previous panel, this has to be a collective work to ensure the privacy, not only at the individual level, but in the collective overarching level, to lead Brazil to a new level, to be able to participate in trade organizations, international trade associations, because the lack of that law today is a barrier for the country. So I am also honored to have in this panel people who, for the past 9 years, have been playing leading roles in this process. Danilo Doneda, who will be the moderator of the debate, and all the other colleagues, people who have contributed significantly for the process and for us to be where we are today. With the bill have been approved unanimously, which is also a reason to celebrate, both in the House and in the Senate. And of course, with civil society also reaching a consensus around the approval of this bill. So I give the floor over to Danilo, who will introduce our panel members, our guests, and who will help us with the activities here. Thank you. Thank you, Flavia. Thank you all for being here till late. It's going to be a very dynamic activity. It is a very to propose a meeting at 6 o'clock, that shows a high level of innovation, right? And we have 12 people on the panel. No easy task, right? No, it is a challenge for the photographers and for the audience, I know, but I'll try to balance all that and to propose a dynamic which will be very active. I'm not going to appoint or to introduce everyone here at the panel, but I'll address each and every one of the participants with one question. And I also like to invite them to make whatever comment they might find adequate as it refers to the Brazilian situation, right? As we approach the date where the bill will be voted, we expect no surprises on that front, but I do believe that diversity of this panel will ensure a very rich debate. So after a first round of comments, I expect to have a good debate amongst the panel members and the audience. So to kick off, I'd like to ask Brascon's representative, I'd like to ask her the following. In this legislative debate about data protection, your association played a very important role favoring the approval of a law, of a bill, which will be very interesting for everyone. So my question is, what does the private sector expect to change when the law comes to pass? And what possible problems do you anticipate should the bill not pass the way, at least the way we expect it to see? Please, Ana Paula, you have the floor to answer that question. Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Danilo, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. One of the main mottos that we have defended across the process is the legal safety, legal security. Increasingly, the country's economy has moved towards a data-based economy and on the need of treating data to be able to innovate. We have an innovative process which is data-based, startups, entrepreneurs, people who are mining data and offering increasingly different services to citizens. And as we have constitutional principles dealing with privacy issues, we have specific clauses in some sectorial legislations, but we do not have a general law to address the topic as a whole. Then we start to assess the issue of personal data from a new perspective, that of the Industry 4.0, there was a perception of legal insecurity. And when companies plan to invest in the country and look at a country as a place for new businesses and for growth, the lack of legal security was a problem. So we see in very good light the passing at the Senate level of this new law, which is a very balanced law in terms of protecting individual rights and also in terms of inducing new businesses in the digital world. What might be a concern for us in terms of a partial approval of the law? We are quite concerned about a fragmentation of the law. The law is poised to work because it's general and well-balanced, can be applied to different sectors of the economy. So possible exclusions or possible fragmentation are indeed a source of concern to us, because we are assuming that personal data within certain contexts deserve more protection than when seen from other contexts. So we defend the full approval of the law, of the bill, because we understand it was quite successful as it tried to gather principles and guiding principles that can be applied equally to personal data across different economic sectors. And we're also very concerned about the definition of the National Authority for Data Protection. The law was structured in such a way that we'll have one single authority that might establish a standard in terms of understanding and in terms of interpreting and applying the law. An authority that might define guidelines as to how the law should be implemented and how violations of the law will be penalized. The risk of not having one single authority applying the law, as it is a cross-sectional law which is applied to all sections of the economy, will hinder the application of the law, will pulverize it, if you will. We won't be able to protect personal data across the board for all economic sectors. We need a reality for data protection, which will be different for different sectors of the economy. So this slicing or this fragmentation of the law, which might arise from the lack of a lack of one single authority, is indeed a source of concern to us. In addition to that, there's an ongoing discussion about the law in terms of that some people say that the law will make public powers activities unfeasible, as it will be opposed to the private sector. And that distinction might seem to arise from a lack or a poor interpretation of the law as a whole, because it does bring a legal base for data processing. It does allow the public power to use data without previous consent for the purposes of public policies. And also, the law makes an exception for the public powers when public safety or public security is in case. So the power of the state is not affected in no level by the law. So that's important to make it clear, at least in the way it has been proposed at the Congress level.
Thank you so much. Anna has emphasized what we have addressed here before. Now we have Renato from the Consumer File Agency, and the issue is data protection. It's very much aligned to positive file in Brazil. And more recently, data protection law became a part of the Congress agenda as there was some changes in the positive files which would slice or fragmented somehow those who are registered in that file. With that, we see a need to a data protection law that would work in that positive file. What is your take on that, Rafael? And how do you understand that authorities should also work for that positive file? Good evening. It's a great honor to be part of this debate. The CGI seminar is a highly skilled forum with a very distinguished audience. So it's very important to be here and to address to a public that really knows about the matter. Let's go back to last year. We had a group of activists from the coalition that stood up on a chair and said, your data, it's you. During the cocktail party, during this forum last September, when personal data discussion was still quite narrow from a public perspective, and ever since those Brazilian activists emerged, we had that polemic of the positive file that came right after your data is you, that happened in the Senate and in the constituent, where they try to show several problems in both federal and legislative administration, where they would put aside the solidarity rules of the file, and that timing really matched the Facebook scandal with the analytic. And to rephrase Mr. Cruz, that was the main digital crisis which we had. And in the National Congress, that even was taken to the National Congress, where several congressmen, they started paying attention to what we were there repeating for months and months, once that was in the cover of the main weekly magazines. Security risks, data privacy. Just when that became public, they finally paid attention. There was another very technical article where experts, they got together to write down a technical note which is published online to the Brazilian bank, Banco do Brasil, and that raised the debate to another level, not just you can and you cannot, but what was the main problem in the Congress. The Congress noticed once they didn't have the political majority in the congressman in the Congress after the Cambridge scandal, they could no longer approve the positive file. IDEC made a public announcement about the importance of personal data privacy, and that became a push to go on with that issue. Authority of personal data in a future scenario when we'll discuss once again the approval of the positive file and the sanction of the current president. They wanted to have the full approval and authority of personal data, and we are waiting for the minister to give his appraisal about that. Two comments about it. First, a convergence of regulatory models in Latin America, where we have this problem of inequality and citizens' protection. It was supposed to understand that in Latin America we had two ways, those that would just protect constitutionally rights. In the literature, they describe it that Brazil, Bolivia, and Honduras, they followed that model. And that division is no longer present. Countries, they are recovering the discussion about the impact of GDPR in the Latin American context and to create that regulatory model by those who have expertise and the penalty ability. Chile, Colombia, Honduras, Costa Rica, each one of them creating their personal data platform. In the Brazilian scenario, there is no problem to understand and advocate for the expansion of members in the positive file with the existence of data authority. We at IDEC advocate that once that legislation of personal data is approved, we go back to the positive file with the solidarity, with the possibility to expand those who are registered, and then we could go on with constitutional authority. Thank you, Rafael. One complements the other, and that has to be debated next. Today, we have the presence of some people who were key in the discussion of data protection throughout the world. We have three representatives from the public and private sectors, which have key positioning and different ways of acting. I would like to ask a question to Boiana Bellamy from CIPO, the Center for Information Policy Leadership, one of the largest think tankers of data privacy in the world. And Boiana Bellamy has been following the Brazilian situation for the past 2 years, has conducted a very successful event in Brasilia, our federal capital, about data protection. And she has followed some other countries which have applied the rules about data protection in Europe and in the United States. And I'd like to hear from you, Bellamy. How can Brazil benefit in a very effective manner at the advantage of being one of the only countries in the world to approve or to pass a law of data protection with the consolidated approval? What is the advantage to be the last one to come to the party, sort of speaking? And what sort of advice would you give to Brazilian companies and to regulators to avoid delays or unnecessary expenditures in energy and resources in passing the new law? Thank you. You have the floor now.
Okay. Oh, it's working. Sorry, I just can't see it. Okay, Danilo, thank you very much for those kind words. And I have had a chance to sort of make some comments this morning, so let me just add to that. I think the beauty of the of Brazil being last in the game or late in the game is that you are able to take best practices around the world and adapt them to your cultural, your needs. And I think that's a benefit to you, because you're able to construct law that actually works for you, works for this country, and works for the companies that operate here in the public sector, and that also works with the expectations of individuals and consumers, to your point. And I actually think, and I've said this morning, congratulations for this bill, because I think it is the right bill to put forward. It is the right law because it is principle-based. It is not detailed, it doesn't go into prescription, it doesn't tell companies how to do things, it tells companies what they should achieve, what is the goal of data protection. That is very, very important. It also very nicely balances innovation, technology, and the human right to data protection, which I think is really important. And I can't stress this enough. To me, privacy laws are not just about protecting people, they're about ensuring that data flows within the economy, within the society, and the data is used responsibly by responsible companies. I always quote Singapore Data Protection Commissioner, but they are really very progressive. And I really advise you to look at that. Danilo, I know you have as well. Privacy Commissioner in Singapore said, my job is not to prevent uses of data. My job is to ensure the data is used responsibly. And I think that's really important. So for those companies here in Brazil, I would say compliance with the law, it shouldn't be just a matter of legal department and data privacy lawyers. It's not just a legal duty. It is actually something that is good for your business, because it is all about having trust and confidence in this digital society. If your consumers do not have trust in what you're saying, you will not have consumers. If you are not able to unpack the value of the data that sits in your companies, unused, forgotten, toxic, sitting at the back, if you don't do that, then you are not going to be competitive. So I really like, and I've been speaking about this a lot, really GDPR beyond legal compliance. And I think that we are now at the point where privacy laws are seen beyond legal compliance. It is actually something that is absolutely necessary for the business. And I would like to see, next year when we come here, I would like to see CEOs, managing directors sitting in this audience, and understanding that this is why, this is important for that reason. It's all about the business, their business strategy, their data strategy, and the digitalization of their companies and the society. I would also like to see public sector involved much more, and I think that's going to be a cultural change for you and for everybody in the world. Governmental agencies are also subject to data privacy laws. They also must be accountable, just like private sector. There is no difference, and this is something that really will require a shift in the way we think about things. And as Laura and I were this morning laughing, when we gave our permission this morning for our photographs and voice to be recorded and data to be used, I had to give my name. Okay, that makes sense because I consent. My marital status, why does it matter that I'm married for this consent? My profession, okay, lawyer, but who cares? My address and my ID number. I didn't have ID number here, but why is this necessary for a simple consent form which says you are supposed to, just consent for the use of my photograph? So because somewhere there is some law which probably says you always have to provide this, but we have to keep shifting and changing. My last point, 30 seconds. Something that I touched upon this morning, and maybe we can touch upon, is that in order for this law to be successful, what is really important is to have what we call at CIPL, we talk about constructive engagement between regulator and regulatees. And that is actually the premise under which you can create successful law and in fact successfully implement the law. Because otherwise you're going to have industry which is defensive, building walls, destroying bridges, and regulators, which is going to be imposing fines and really too strong, perhaps, for what the law requires. But I'm happy to touch that in the questions more.
Thank you very much, Baiana.
Thank you this morning and now. She mentioned very important points of regulation, and CGI would like to thank, on behalf of CGI, thank you for your contribution, for granting your image for us here and your voice, so for allowing us to use your voice and image. Thank you, Baiana. The first seminars we put together, we are now in the 9th edition. Back in the day, they were more abstract than this one. Today, we have a law, a bill to be voted. We have concrete issues to discuss. And the tendency is that these seminars become even more real, more concrete when we have real application problems that are interested not only to the population as a whole, but to different industries when we feel affected by the implementation of the law. And this will turn these discussions much more overarching and reaching more people than today. So in this sense, it is very important that we find potential blind spots of people who are not being reached. I don't know, expert communities and points that are not naturally seen or observed or identified by those who are not very much involved with the matter. So I'd like to ask our secretary, Tiago Camargo, which would be the points when we talk about the regulation that we are proposing to be passed in the near future. What are the points which are more concerning to him? What would be the main challenges he sees going forward, and what kind of tools would we have in hand to counteract those threats? Good evening, everyone. I'll wait for the clock to start counting. Or I'll just kick it off. All right, I'll just kick it off. Okay, let's go for it. Well, thank you for the kind words and for giving me more time. So first I have to separate that question. We have a positioning. We're now waiting for the pass, but we vetoed the creation of the authority as it is presented. And the motivation for the veto, it's because we see it as non-constitutional, and there are also merit issues. And transparency is fundamental. So to make it clear, what have we defended? We have defended that, specifically for the creation of the authority, that there is no vacatio legis, that we do not have to wait 1.5 years to have that in place. So we vetoed the creation of the authority the way it is presented. We want it to be created as soon as possible, not wait 1.5 years. Why? Because we would have a window of a learning curve, which might be important. We would have 18 months to address different impacts of the law, of the full enforcement of the law. So our guidance is that we veto that now, and that we have a legislative instrument for the government to create an authority right now. And we proposed that that authority be multi-sectorial with sanctioning powers. And multi-sectorial, I emphasize. As for regulating points specifically, we have discussed several of those points. I will focus on what is more bothersome to me, a single point, which seems to be more problematic. Something I could never waive, which is the possibility of having auditing processes in databases without a legal decision or a court decision. I think no government should have the power of audit a database based only on an administrative order. You need the legal court order. Whenever you give that power to a governor, you're going into trouble. We can only do what is expressly written in the law. If the law dictates, all you need to have is courage. So I do not think it is healthy to grant that level of authority. We're talking about a very horizontal law. And so that can lead to dumping, to unfair competition, a series of issues. So I trust the Brazilian democracy. And so I also trust that the country will choose our next president and come November. And I don't want to run the risk of having somebody less democratic to explore that power. And if we move forward, and Ana Paula mentioned this one single authority, but if we address Article number 8, that says that individuals may resort to the Code of Consumer Defense of Consumer. But if we have a commercial relationship, our Constitution guarantees or ensures that states can legislate on that. So I'll be able to give local authority to a local manager to legislate on a database. I do not want to see that. I believe, once again, that no government should have the right to audit a database without a court order. That's the summary, the baseline of what I wanted to say. Well, I have 1 minute in your name now as a credit for the final. So, as to the law, even though it has some degree of complexity, it is a result which is somewhat familiar with other legislation about data protection. And in my case, in Laura's case, just a personal note, it's curious to see the result, almost confirmed, of a document over which we had been working for more years than I'd like to believe. I'd like to ask Laura two things. Did you have the feeling at some point that some part of the document, of the bill, once approved, gained a different meaning, a different depth, was potentialized when compared to the first lines, the first documents, the first text? And secondly, to what extent a full approval would bring more benefits than harm? Well, thank you for your question. Thank you, Danilo. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be in this panel. First of all, I'd like to agree with some of what was said. The bill, of course, has been a significant advance, a move forward after 8 years of discussions, really a big leap forward to our society. We had a big gap. There was no general regulation on data flows, so a big advancement not only to protect data for Brazilian citizens, but also to bring on board more legal security for all of those processing data. Of course, now, on the verge of the approval, we're a week away from the vote, we are now facing this preoccupation. When we look at this advance on paper, will it materialize? And why do I ask that? Because if the law is not fully approved, if it is not fully passed in all its complexity and its entirety, in theory, all that expected advance won't take place. It would be like a Pyrrhic victory, if I may, if we pass it only in half or in part. So that is really a source of concern for us on the verge of the vote. It is an advance. It will materialize as an advance if we manage to have it fully passed. And also if we have the authority to enforce it. If that does not come to fruition, the best scenario would be to remain in the previous situation. But we could go backwards, depending on whatever comes out of that, the kind of veto that we see, we might walk backwards in the process. So that's a very important moment we're going through right now, of high expectations, no doubt. And as to your questions, Danilo, I think as to what refers to the authority, I think we need to preserve three pillars. What does the authority need to have? Sanctioning power is one, to preserve the sanctioning powers contemplated by the law. Otherwise, we know that whatever compliance measure will only take place because of the law, because if I have sanctioning power, otherwise the law will remain on paper. On top of that, we need expertise because we're talking very specific topic. I cannot attribute that competence to a different existing authority. Why? Because the nature of the object to be regulated is quite different from any other object. I cannot have another agency, another authority regulating other topics to regulate this specific topic. It's a different expertise. And lastly, it needs to be independent. I cannot have an authority which will, for example, regulate the public sector, but which is also internalized or falls into the public administration. It needs to be independent. I cannot have an authority regulating one sector because we're talking about the horizontal nature of the topic. It needs to address all sectors across the board, and independence is crucial for that authority to really have credibility before Brazilian society, before companies, before all the stakeholders, and that's so that in the future we might submit our participation at the OCDE and Europe and other forums worldwide. So right now, what seems to be relevant to me is that we do need the bill to be passed today in full, and more than that, the model that we have today is an initial model, first steps, first assumptions, basic requirements such as the mandate or the term in office for the council members. But we also have a big challenge, which is to complete or to finalize the making up of that authority. That's the only way I see that law really materializing into concrete results. Thank you, Laura. Our guest, Bruno Giancarelli, as it was said this morning, heads a unit geared towards data protection and data flows. Data flows has been gaining ground in this debate. Boiana mentioned Singapore, their commissar, the data exchange, data flows is what needs to be protected. Right. And Brazil, with this new legislation coming in place, will position itself potentially as one of the countries that might be part of regimes that provide benefits for data flows happening with less bureaucracy, less cost, and so on. So my question to Bruno Giancarelli is the following. What are the main points in the Brazilian bill, which you know very well, which would make it easier for Brazil to insert itself in this flow? And on top of that, later on in the future, after the law is passed, what practices should be put in place to implement the law? And what should be careful about implementing? Always looking at becoming members of these larger countries where we have data flows internationally going that can, at the end, benefit society and the citizens. Bruno, please.
We'll use this one. It's good to be back here, and I want to congratulate the audience for its resilience, because it's more than 7 o'clock in the evening, and still people are there to listen to us. Well, as I said this morning, with this, and without entering, you will understand, in purely domestic discussion, because some decisions have still to be taken. But this with this bill, clearly Brazil is not only being part, but contributing to very much to this convergence path we were discussing this morning. It is you're asking about the elements. Well, overarching legislation, a legislation that applies across the board, across sectors, across the private and public sectors, across business model, across industries. That's extremely important for both a question of protection, but also a question of enabling data to move and to flow, and avoid this sort of silo regulation that we have seen in the past and that are ineffective in a digital economic context. So that's, for instance, an element that is very clearly in the Brazilian law, and that you find in many other legislations that are either adopted and or recently adopted or modernized. A common set of enforceable rights, a common set of principles, and those are the typical principles of data protection. As I said, a law that addresses, and that's very important, the broad range of processing operation with a number of different legal bases. This is far from being a consent-only based system, and that's very good, because there are a diversity of processing operation that require diverse tools. And then last, but certainly not the least, indeed, and again, without entering into too much into debates that are currently taking place, the provision of and the creation, the setting up of a independent authority responsible for the oversight and the enforcement of that law. We discussed this this morning. We discussed the advantage of having some authority, both for citizens in terms of accessible point of contact, and for business in terms of having consistent enforcement, having also, because the law needs to be kept general and technological and sector neutral, the need to adapt the implementation of the law to a fast evolving environment, both from a technological and economic point of view. So all this we said this morning. I note that this again is an approach which is increasingly adopted by many countries around the world. It's far from being a European thing. We see it from Japan to this region of the world. And what is very important, what very interesting for us coming from Europe, is that few years ago, when we were talking about these issues in Latin America, we were told, guess what, our constitutional framework is different. We cannot have independent authorities in the way you have them in Europe. And then I'm seeing that, and that's very good news, because that answers to, and that it should be like this, it answers to domestic demands. I'm seeing increasingly in Latin American countries ways to, within, of course, the domestic framework, and in full compliance with policy choices that are, of course, legitimate and in full compliance with constitutional legal tradition. But I see increasingly these authorities being created. Recently in Chile, we can talk about Mexico and others. So this is also something that, again, where and it should be like this, where convergence, international convergence, can also meet local requirements and domestic legal tradition. Why is this important? And I have 4 seconds or 3 seconds to say it, because that can very significantly facilitate data flows. We had identified Brazil as one of the country which is on a very top of a list in terms of priorities, in terms of having what we call an adequacy arrangement, that this law would allow this and would complement and facilitate data flows that are already very important between the EU and Brazil in the commercial sector, but also in other areas where exchange of data are very important, areas of regulatory cooperation, of law enforcement cooperation. So, as I said this morning when closing my remark, we should and we can be ambitious here. So we are certainly welcoming very much those developments and eager to see when without any negative connotation to that, but when this saga will end and how.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno.
Vinicius Carvalho was in a very interesting position a few years back. He was the Secretary of Economic Right at the Ministry of Justice. And that's where we saw the first documents being written for the final text, which will be approved now. So I have two questions for Vinicius. He was paying close attention, I noticed, and he's interested in competition and data protection. So Vinicius, do you anticipate, do you see any interposition between data protection systems and the competition law that might be approached in the coming future, whether by the authority, whether by the Consumer Defense Council? And question number two is a very free, very open question. Vinicius had the privilege of working in structuring the new code for the defense of the consumer, also called the super code. And the success of that code is due to the work that he and other people did, but he was very much involved. And that competence might come in handy as we structure a new agency for data protection. We have been hearing rumors about possibilities of making up this new agency for data protection, different formats that might arise as we move forward. We'll also talk about alternative formats. So I'd like to ask Vinicius, which format do you think would be more appropriate in the makeup of a new authority for data protection?
Well, how to answer these two questions in just 5 minutes? Well, I'll do my best. Thank you again for the invitation. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will start answering your last question. As data protection discussion, it will happen as they already happen, and with this personal data protection law that requires or demands more interaction, competition, and data as being an asset to be understood from a competition standpoint.
Questão da autoridade, né?
As to authority, law creates an authority with a specific model based on a committee, like a board of directors, where people will discuss, offer guidelines, and a channel of communication to the society, and then a steering committee, sort of speaking. 3 people. That model, which is similar to those autarky models in a special regimen. This regimen has got several positive dimensions. The model by itself may have positive or negative models, and in practical terms that may get inverted depending as how things are implemented. But as we are still talking about the law on the book and not in action, let's try to think positively for those positive potentials offered by the model. Whenever we talk about autonomy, we have something which not only regards to autonomy in relation to government, companies, or markets in general, because somehow it will regulate some type of governmental activity, not only regulating, but offering guidelines and even maybe to penalties some governmental agencies that go against that trend. Of course, autonomy, it's important to guarantee some waive, and you have to have a term which will cope with that. And autonomy in that sense has a different, another dimension to be highlighted. Anytime we are dealing with a public policy which will interact to a number of other agents, civil society, companies, as well as other agencies that will feel legitimacy to apply that law, such as PROCON, public ministry, I should say, and some other agencies that may say, well, I also do want to apply and enforce the law. And the autonomy of such an agency in the federal government should protect its ability to have legitimacy to dialogue with those agents and somehow to be a reference. I have dealt with several governmental models. I have worked for the Human Rights Secretary, so I had to deal with all those things, such as CONAN, the Human Rights Committee, Committee of Lesbian, Gays, Transsexuals Committee, people with a visual or physical deficiency, with different committees, national committees that they aim to design guidelines. I also had to deal with CAD, which is that positive registry, and even the National Model of Consumers Defense. That system is very important as part of that law because legitimacy is driven from the central agency that will take those politics to agents that will implement law as a whole. Otherwise, there will be a chaos, constitutional chaos, leading to major risks as a consequence of that. Autonomy has to be built up, of course, and we may even discuss about all possible models. And that autonomy is important not only in that governmental relationship, but to have that as an agency which is legal and has legitimacy to do it, and people will look at that and will say, well, those guys are doing things as expected. There is no wrapped interest to A or to B sides. So let's not forget taking that into account. Andre Gutierrez, he works for a company called IBM with plans and process to personal data, allowing services, utilities, etc. The company favors the law, and I'd like to hear from you, Andre. Companies like yours, they apply to people issues that will go much beyond the privacy, such as new possibilities, new relations, new services, and from personal data that may create new opportunities or even some limitations to people's lives. So I'd like to ask you, Andre, you are the person to answer to that. What does the company and you as well, what do you forecast in terms of data use, not just referring to privacy, but talking about the fact of the use of personal data that can be communicated and taken to citizens, and if that can be seen as a hurdle where useful services may be available to the market? Thank you so much for your question, Danilo. We understand that we are building up a new digital society. We are going through a transition from an industrial society to a digital one. And it's important to have trust, reliability. We have pillars that will foster the new socio-economic development. And by trust, I mean company-wise trust from governmental standpoint, which are those rules to foster public services, and from citizens wise, they have to know if that is bringing or adding any social economic process to that subject. I understand that the digital transforming strategy, the Brazilian one, of course, that has been well understood, that pillar is key. I also would like to say that we have a very important fight ahead, which is to make the law fully applied. That was a rather long debate. It lasted for 8 or 9 years until it became really mature and feasible to all. The panel before ours was discussing about that. I understand that that was not a project that is a perfect one, but an ideal one where we have we don't want to slice that so much and maybe to hinder its reliability. And difficult after all comments which we have heard here today, and I believe and I agree with most of them. And some of the characteristics of this authority, as Laura said, autonomy, independence, central approach, centrality. Bojana has mentioned that widely this morning, penalty power, and including the dialogue that we have with the executive power and with the Congress House. The fact is there is a strong debate about the origin of such authority, leading to a legal insecurity as to fiscal responsibility and the possibility or impossibility to create that authority, vacatio legis, the debate in the press about regulatory agencies that has been somehow pressing the Congress House. What worries me the most is the veto indication by the Congress House, and how will that be placed? So to fulfill the law and to meet the law so that it doesn't become so complicated. And second, how to apply, in which conditions will that be applied? In a short period of time in the democratic dialogue, if so, with an immediate application. It is if that alternative is a draft, and there is a risk to open to some other draft that will take many, many years, and maybe we will end up losing the vacatio legis time. Having said that, democratical debate is key. That has to be our main pillar. We have to pursue it, to turn the debate more mature. And once that is in the Republic's hands, it is about time that they release a democratic solution as how to do it. Our next international guest, Sophie Quazins, she works in the Council of Europe, the 180 Convention. During the 70s and 80s, data protection was a topic that was enlarged due to the need to address legal tools to advocate for individual freedom in face of technology. Personal data, data bank. And since its first version in 1981, the Council of Europe was really strong in emphasizing the topic from a fundamental rights angle, fundamental citizens' freedom that is present in the last revision, last March, but much has happened ever since. Nowadays, fundamental freedom is an important factor to several other discussions related to data protection. Council of Europe is a concrete and strong reference about the topic from a different bias. So let me ask you, Sophie, in your experience with the 108 Convention, do you see the importance of the European Council? Do you see any balance, the geopolitical data protection globally? If it was not for the 108 Convention, maybe that topic would be out of the agenda, of the human agenda. And how do you see Brazil to become a part of the 108 Commission as an observer, and how positive or beneficial can that be to Brazil for data protection?
Obrigada. Boa noite. Our moderator introduced the panel saying it was an innovative panel. I can only agree. I will call it the happy hour panel. It's a first for me, and I welcome the initiative, so thank you to the organizers. I've been following the strict instructions we had to get a glass, so I have my glass. I have an audience, so the problem is that when you have a French woman with a glass of wine and an audience, there is a need for an endless toast. No, this is just, I reassure you, it's just to get your attention. I will not toast yet. I think it's a bit early, but I would have liked to toast to the bill. I'm superstitious, I won't do it. So to respond to your question, I will only draw back the history first of Convention 108, in particular with regard to supervisory authorities. I won't take too much of your time because I think actually what was the most interesting was to have the take of the national actors on this topic and not our perspective. I said it this morning, the 1981 convention, 30 years ago, did not have any DPA, any supervisory authorities foreseen. So that was the start in Europe. It did not exist. And then rapidly the Council of Europe saw the lacuna and the fact that this crucial element was missing. And then we are 20 years later, we're in 2001 with the additional protocol to Convention 108, which is a short protocol. It's about two topics: transborder data flows outside the parties and supervisory authorities. And so the article on supervisory authorities in 2001 was quite straightforward, very few lines, with the powers, the duties, the independence of the DPA. That was it, 2001. We are now 2018, 17 years later, and there a strong acknowledgement. It's not in an additional protocol anymore. It's not optional like it's been so far. It's an absolute necessity. So supervisory authority is an absolute necessity. You have an entire chapter of the Modernized Convention 108 dealing with the supervisory authorities. So instead of 2-3 articles, we have very lengthy articles describing the duties, the task, the mission, the resources. And one very important part that is detailed is the cooperation between DPAs. And I think that's crucial. And there I come back to your question about geopolitics, geography also of our work, is that we've seen it, and it's been said before, it's not European anymore, this need of a supervisory authority. We are working with countries on all continents that have similar models. Why? Because they are working together on the same topics, and to have this cooperation, not to be in an isolated position, you need such an authority with similar powers. So indeed, I can only from a Council of Europe perspective highlight that if there is a willingness from Brazil in the future to join a convention like our convention, having a supervisory authority would be needed. That's the response. And the first step would be observer status. I hope we can get there quickly. So thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Bia Barbosa works for the Coletivo Intervozes. That is a collective of social communication. And there are some players performing a very important role in approving that draft in the civil society. Social communication such as freedom of expression, protection to journalists, among others. To data protection and privacy, has that happened naturally, or were there any obstacles on the way? Did you have any moment of doubt or not? And finally, what are the key aspects in the legislation?
I'll answer with the question. What is the relevance of personal issues and questions for this debate? No, just kidding, just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I acknowledge the question. Thank you, Danilo, for your question. I'm just kidding. Of course, it makes all the sense in the world to be here in this debate within a scenario where the internet becomes one of the most important forums for the exercise of free expression. And when we talk about the access to diverse contents, access to different sources, and as we try to understand or see the citizen as a potential content creator, somebody who is competing for values, for visions of the world, for principles, if we do not make sure we have a diversified, open internet, that freedom of expression, which is traditionally limited, will be even more limited and now in the internet forum. And freedom of speech is core to this. For us, as an organization linked to freedom of expression, to participate in a debate is fundamental. And it was not difficult because we started discussing this 4 years ago when we discussed the legal framework, and it was only natural for us now to continue to prioritize this conversation, this debate, as we talk about privacy as it relates to data, personal data protection. So there was no doubt, there was never any doubt. We only saw challenges, but as you mentioned, we are a collective group of communicators. Now we have a couple of lawyers joining the ranks, but we are a group of communicators, and we study law and work in Congress with law. So it was a very challenging process, but we never had any doubt in terms of how strategic this was. And our collective is part of a coalition of rights in the network, gathering several civil society associations, and then we have been fighting together for 2 years, working together for a long time around topics such as access, privacy, and freedom of expression. When Rafael mentioned the launch of the campaign, "You are your data," that was the campaign, that became our priority, not only for Intervoices, but of all the other institutions that are part of the coalition. An important aspect of the legislation I'd like to emphasize is the following. Sometimes the debate revolves around the digital economy, but for our coalition, that law is also fundamental so that we ensure we are not limited to economics, that the debate goes beyond economics, that aims at striking a balance between this data market and citizens' rights, which need to be preserved and protected. One of those fundamental rights for us is exactly freedom of speech. For us, as it has been said before, and I was very impacted by Andre's speech, it was not the ideal law, let's say, from our point of view. We saw that the period of absence of law too long, as he did, the vacatio legis period. We think that the civil society needs something different. When we talk about state security, we talk about one thing. When we talk about crime, we talk about something different. But we understood it to be what was possible at the time. And we are now campaigning. I'd like to have the projection here on the screen. We are now campaigning for the approval with no veto. So it's a calling to the president saying, President Temer, approve it without any veto. That's the motto. So we want to pressure the federal government. We went through a very rich process, a very rich negotiation throughout several years. When we started talking about it way back in the day, the continuity of this process requires that we listen to what society has to say. It would have been great if we had counted on the presence of the president here today so that he could hear from different places, different countries, what we had to say, reaffirming the importance of passing that law. I was happy to hear Tiago that he has only one source of concern, one, because we started negotiating this text, this document, running the risk of having 50% of the law vetoed. So as we are approaching a few days of the voting, and we know that Tiago is not speaking on behalf of the president, but he is a government representative. And if he says his only concern has to do with the audit process, I think we have advanced significantly. So let's sit around the table and negotiate that so that we can ensure the full approval of the remainder of the law. In conclusion, I think we have also a challenge, and that's how I conclude, Danilo. We have a challenge of explaining the impact of the law to people in a more productive manner. It's not only fighting fake news. That's not the issue here. But the discussion about the penalties, for example, issue which was raised in some of the panels earlier today, if you read Articles 53 and 54, we see that we have clearly explicit a different amounts, different penalties, a gradual increase of that's explicitly included there. So that might be the result of the fact that several sectors did not have a chance to participate in the process, and they are now poring over the document and finding questions or doubts. So we need to clarify what the law actually makes explicit. And of course, pressure the president to approve it with no veto. And we count on everyone for that. Can I use my 1 minute of credit that I have? Just to say, I didn't say I had only one source of concern. I have several. But what I did say was that I have one point that is fundamental for me, which is the main source of concern for me. The other points can be worked around. We have 1.5 years to discuss, talk, sit around the table and negotiate, but this specific point is non-negotiable or shouldn't be negotiable because a database is very important. And I'm not talking about a social media company. I'm talking about press companies or communication groups or companies that might have databases which need to be protected. So that's non-negotiable because the trade-off between freedom and law enforcement, we need to draw a line. And a law which should protect privacy will create a gap which will place administrative decision in the hands of somebody who's in the government. That shouldn't be the case. We need an independent authority. We mentioned several companies, CGI and IT companies, internet companies, but there is a myriad of sectors which is affected, of course. The private sector specifically, and Henrique van Haber, he is a business leader in the technology sector. He's in direct contact with several companies which are not big companies, companies which do not have previous experiences, do not have experiences from abroad with data protection law. So, Henrique, how do you see, you and other mid-size companies, how do you see the bill? How do you see, in what way do you think this bill can help you enter different markets? Would you have some, for example, caveats or insecurities as to the application of this bill? It's been discussed thoroughly. It looks good on paper. It hasn't been implemented. What is your perception coming from your end, a mid-sized communication or technology company? Thank you, Danilo. Good evening. My conclusion of the day is that we have good news. After 9 years of meetings, we have reached a consensus, a bill which will be passed. And this is good news, of course. But the other piece of good news is that we'll continue to talk about it because there is a series of questions which remain open-ended and need to be discussed so that the application of the bill, as it becomes a law, the enforcement of all of that, and the materialization of those ideas might come to fruition. When you talk about mid-sized companies, we need to debate how to more appropriately apply that new law. I come from the IT sector, and I represent not only small to mid-sized companies, but I also work with some big companies. And more recently, we had very heated discussions around a concern that that bill might increase what is known around the world as the Brazil cost. That would make things more expensive for small companies in terms of complying to the new bill. I'm now speaking on my personal behalf because I have not had a chance to discuss that thoroughly with many of those institutions, but I can give you my personal take on the topic in terms of what can be done in relation to small to mid-sized companies. As we have that 18-month window before the enforcement of the law, and I think the authority should be created before the end of that window. But anyway, the regulations and the methodology around which the authority will work, I believe not only in terms of dosing the penalties, but also in terms of in the very process of the application of the law in other countries, as we compare that, it's important to identify the larger risks to privacy and data protection. And as you identify the larger risks, you will be able to understand where or identify which companies have larger data volumes and which companies are looking to make money based on personal data. And those institutions will receive from the regulating agency a larger level of attention, if you will. So if we have an adequate application, not only for small IT companies, but for small companies across different industries in this next period, I hope it's not 9 years, I hope it's less than 9 years, but I hope in this next period going forward, we do not want to see the law attached to an increase in the Brazil cost, but we want it to be seen as an opportunity to protect Brazilian citizens or citizens of the world, and also to allow companies, Brazilian companies, to participate in the global market. Unfortunately, we're looking internally more than anything else. And I think we are coming to a point where there will be opportunities for small companies to explore markets outside our borders. That's it. Thank you, Henrique. Thank you, Henrique. We have reached the last participant, believe it or not, Carlos Afonso. We worked together with law and IT before people talked about personal data. I'll take the liberty of not asking a single question to him. I will loan him part of my moderating power for him to introduce the debate and for him to make questions that should be discussed. Please.
A gente não combinou quem receberia qual.
Bess, we did not appoint people to answer the questions, and you remained quiet. I'll feel free. Tiago needs to leave. Tiago has a piece of news. The directive panel of the Senate announced today a new consolidation of the text, which was approved in the Senate with some adaptations coming from that consolidation. According to the information from the Senate, the idea was to bring the text closer to what was presented. New changes might happen in the future. So I consulted the Senate website, and it is official, August the 8th, tomorrow, the act is published. So, Tiago, I am relieved on the one hand, because we have our foreign guests participating in this moment. I wouldn't know how to explain that to them, right? I'm relieved. It's only things that only Brazil can do for you.
Yes, Ben.
Renato has also some information to share. No.
Tiago.
Tiago, when you compare both texts, there is no change in the wording of the document, no change in the wording of the document. So it's the same content we're talking about. So there's a change in the signatures. So I have the same information you have. There's no change in content, no change in wording. So that shouldn't affect the date of the sanction. When you compare both documents, the one presented before and the one analyzed today, there is no change in content, in wording. So let's go back to Carlos here. Nothing has been solved, so let's go back to Carlos. So I am not here to bring certainty to the debate. But Danilo, I don't know what I should do now. I'd like to also make a few questions. How many more hours do we have to go here tonight? Formally, 65 minutes. So I think we need to keep with the schedule. We cannot finish before, otherwise we'll be disappointed. There might come across the fact that there was not enough subject to discuss, or that there was consensus that we should finish. Anyway, thinking about our debate, should we choose to explore the minutes that we have, I have a few suggestions of points to be discussed. Thinking about the bill that might come to be approved, let's not think about possible vetoes. I'll just like to recap a few points which were mentioned during the debate. Number one, the issue of penalties. I'd like to link that with the Internet legal framework, the Marco Civil, as we call it. We have been discussing how penalties will be levied and so on and so forth, and we hear rumors and suggestions, and we hear about possible vetoes. But even though we are not in favor of vetoes, it's worth mentioning that the Internet legal framework has a very important provision about that, which are Articles 10, 11, and 12, which deal with collection, storage, and processing of personal data, and which also describe possible issues, problems, breaches. And we know that Articles 11 and 12, Article 11 describes all that and mentions possible penalties, and Article 12 says that on top of criminal and civil penalties, we can also have, and then we have a list, we can have a series of sanctions. Article 12 today is being questioned at the Supreme Court, but it wouldn't be surprising to reach an understanding around the application of those provisions of the legal framework to lead to penalties, to collection, storage, and use of personal data in a non-compliant way with the Brazilian legislation, especially when we have the new law already enforced. So I'd like to mention that point specifically about the legal framework. So I'd like to remain within this topic, the topic of the Internet legal framework. When we articulate the data protection law and the Internet legal framework, we will have a certain dynamic which will have to evolve throughout that 1.5 window of absence of law, right? We'll need to articulate those two different documents. And we need to talk, for example, about the consent. In the legal framework, the consent is explicit, not so in the data protection law. So on top of the penalty issue, we'll need to have a little more thorough discussion in how those two documents can coexist. I had the opportunity of talking about it without being pressured by the moderator, as I am now, with more time. But as a reminder, you all remember your time in class when we started studying law. When you talk about law conflicts, different criteria to solve that. The data law will be chronologically superior because it will be posterior to the Internet law. On the other hand, some might question the specificity of the law. So which would be the specific law? The data law, because it's specific, or the Internet framework, because it is about the Internet? So that's a debate that will need to be faced. But I'll remain here just to introduce this discussion, articulating both documents. Can they coexist? Thank you, CAF.
Ponderação, provocação que você fez, levantando um tema que
Well, this is a topic which has already been discussed in other editions, which is the dialogue between legal framework and data protection, which is a concrete aspect with different interpretations when that law applies to the online setting. I would like to benefit from CAF's provocation, although it's quite late, he says, and I'd like to take that question not only to the audience, but not only to our panelists, but to the audience. Maybe someone would like to ask a question to someone in the panel. So now we are formally open for the Q&A session. No one question. Statistically speaking, few people had left. Well, probably everybody's quite tired, which is not a surprise. So you prefer to answer your own questions? Well, we should audit Percival's mind. No, I don't think we can do that. No. Setting jokes apart, I have a question to Tiago. As he said that the non-negotiable point would be auditing with no legal suit or lawsuit, which other ones could have a veto or penalty or veto of some parts of that draft? Well done. What would you like to hear? If you can, or what's happening within the government? Well, I will share with you at a certain extent. 98% of transparency is the same as 2% of opacity. The Treasurer has submitted an appraisal of 152 pages. I don't know what is written there, but it quite scares me, 152 pages. Some questions as to possibility of sharing data from public sector to private one, if that can or cannot affect social programs such as the family program or any other benefits such as consignatory loan. Well, but if you have to take everything, you can solve that in a couple of months. In case of the family program, you cannot let to solve that within 2 months because we are talking about a great number of Brazilian families. So you have to be sure that that will not be affected. And I had submitted that to the MDRS. Consignment law is not a silly topic because they are raising from 1.5 to 2.5%. In fact, it's a reduction of over 50% of loan to retired people, to an emergency surgery. So we cannot play around with that. In the last meeting where there were over 40 representatives, there were over 40 vetoes. Now, I guess we are perceiving a reduction of that. We still have to wait and hear the Treasurer's appraisal, but well, they keep talking about building up authority and penalties. The Justice Ministry said that he will request a veto as to that. There is a certain veto request as to the 8th paragraph of Article 18. At the same time that you create a law to become a single authority, you render a liability to consumers' agencies. I openly advocate for the creation of the authority, and then we will discuss about some dubious points of the law in the next 18 months. People keep saying, if you have any doubts, just come and ask to us. Well, we do not care about the opinion. Those that will apply the law is the federal ministry, the treasurer, and that somehow leads to some insecurity. So it's quite natural that people fear what can or cannot affect the CPF of subjects. And there is also a risk of some law slicing. But it seems to me, as far as I know, that the focus is not to open any precedent and to become legitimate, a situation which is constitutional in order not to reflect in some other cases. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Would you like, Boyana, to make any comment?
Because this is really difficult. First of all, it's very late. It's such a difficult and quick discussion. So you're doing a great job, and I hope I have understood this. But I wanted to make two comments. One about this potential concerns that I'm hearing from you around the right to audit. Let me take this off. Right to audit by Data Protection Authority. Look. This right exists. All the other data protection authorities in the world do have right to inspect, audit, and investigate, and they even have right to enter premises. And these rights were perhaps less certain before the GDPR. Now, after GDPR, this is clearly the case. It's also true in many other countries. And I don't think this is a problem if it is framed properly. Remember, data protection authorities are also statutory bodies. They operate under a certain law. They're not they haven't got powers which are arbitrary. These powers are enshrined in the law. And it's actually the data protection law that includes and explains these powers. So, for example, they are subject to confidentiality duty themselves. So anything they find out, they cannot use or disclose, talk to the press, and so on. They also have to maintain commercial and trade secrets. And in fact, sometimes companies also have, they don't need to disclose all the data in the audit because there is privilege information, for example, because there is a legal privilege as well. Also, where there is a right of freedom of information, you cannot get the data of another company through freedom of information request to a data protection authority. So I'm just giving you examples to say that this is, in all the other countries, it seems to work because the law should also provide for these protections by the, protections and limitations of power by the DPA as well. And that's totally normal. I don't know, you might have heard that the UK Information Commissioner has, in fact, asked for additional powers in order to be able to investigate Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica, as a company, has actually decided to stop trading. They changed the name, they closed the company, they shut their files, shut the computers, and they opened under a different name. And the ICO in the UK didn't have powers to go after this other company and to try to obtain all this information. But they were given these powers by the judge and by the law now as well. And this is very important because in this world of data, you have to be able to access the servers, the computers, the documents, and it is totally normal. And it is shocking to me as a citizen that a company can operate one day and then close their shop and then open under another name. And now they're not liable because That, you see, and that's what's going to be happening. In UK, we talk about builders, you know, people who build your house, they go bankrupt and you can't sue them. Well, this is happening with data companies like Cambridge Analytica, and this is terrible. So you need to give these powers to DPA. But anyway, that's just kind of one comment I wanted to make. The other thing is around penalties. I think this is really important. Look, it is a very well understood principle of law and administrative law that penalties have to be proportionate, they have to be fair, they have to, there's a gradation in penalties. It's not easy for any regulator to impose penalties. For example, we've had discussion with the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, who now, you may know, oversees a number of big tech companies because they're all headquartered in Ireland. So this is the main regulator for them in Europe. And today, they don't have any powers of fines. Under GDPR, they will have. And they were talking to us and saying that it takes about 5 to 10 years for a regulator to learn how to impose fines. This is not something you just impose one day and you go and you are happy and you take the money. No, it doesn't work like that because companies are going to complain. They're going to contest these fines. So it takes really a lot of understanding and maturity to know how to impose a fine. And if you look at the GDPR, those of you who are interested, Article 83 has got about 15 different mitigations, things that the Data Protection Authority must take into account as and when they are deciding on fines, including whether company is an accountable company, whether they have a privacy program, have they done what is possible, what is best practice, have they got a code, and so on and so forth. And so I think I would expect the same to be in Brazil.
First, I have actually a question. Maybe I'm a bit tired and I waked up all of a sudden with this news. But does this mean that the deadline for the veto is postponed?
We don't know.
It's a question.
Okay, so it's not a stupid question.
We're Brazilian or Italian,
question.
We don't know.
It's not a stupid question. Because I was talking about the saga, I didn't know to be so right. But anyway. Well, I don't want to repeat what Bojana said, but first, an authority, but that's true for Brazil as it's true for the EU, doesn't act in a vacuum. A public authority, as a data protection authority, of course, works under the control of a judge. And of course, I guess that here you are more mentioning procedural aspects, whether the authority should get a warrant or something like this to be able to do this inspection. But indeed, having effective power, we were discussing this morning. There are 3 elements of independence. If you want, the structural, the organic aspect of independence, then the functional independence, and then also having effective powers and functions. Otherwise, independence is a very nice concept that remains in the book. And having the power to inspect is indeed part of those effective power, of course, under all the necessary requirements, including procedural requirements. We have a system where, indeed, an authority first has to get a warrant from a judge and then being able to do this inspection. Other systems provide that the authority, of course, within certain framework can do that, and then is then checked, I would say, ex post. But indeed, if we want to have fines, we want these fines to be based on evidence and to be based on a file. And when we are talking about data processing, those are very concrete, tangible, pragmatic things, and that's part. We certainly don't want the authorities to impose fine and close in the room without having seen and understood things. We have other examples coming from that, I'm sure, also in Brazil, from competition authorities, etc. We also see that many inspections never lead to anything because the authority also realized that there might not be a violation. On fines, indeed, but that's the experience we have because these powers already exist in Europe for certain authorities. As I said this morning, DPAs didn't, even with their new power, didn't turn overnight into a fining machine. First, there's a broad, I would say, toolbox in terms of responses to violation, and they are from soft instruments such as recommendation of warnings, to injunctive relief, to orders to suspend or to put an end to an unlawful processing, to financial sanctions. Financial sanctions are one of the possibilities. And indeed, one of the first things our authorities did is to adopt fining guidelines, which further substantiate the 11 factors you can find in the GDPR, which range from gravity of the sanction to duration to any degree of cooperation of the company with the authority, and that's exactly how you start in that business, defining the guidance by which are guidance, but which bound the authorities when imposing those fines, and this is typically also something on which, in terms of advantage of having an authority, I think that what we will see when we are talking about convergence, again, international convergence, both in terms of protection, but also in terms of providing more legal certainty, will be increasingly not only on the law, on the statute, what is in the books, but in cooperation between authorities, because authorities will increasingly face a similar violation or similar commercial practice, will have to interpret the laws and apply. We see it. Let's take a data breach or an incident like Facebook Cambridge Analytica. It impacts at the same time dozens of jurisdictions. That's an area where which needs to certainly to be developed, and where again an authority and an independent authority can play an important role. And finally, I hope I haven't heard this, but I understand the questions around investigations and inspections, but I hope it would, because you said something like it would be problematic if one part of the government would have access to indeed database, etc. But that's I would say the core of the issue of independence. It will not be one part of the. If it's a truly independent authority, that independence will be part of those guarantees that ensure indeed that it's not the government that enters into a premise and then inspect a database of files because it might have issues with that competence. I think that indeed is a further argument for a truly independent authority.
So you can rest calm. You are hearing really well. So let me go into details. Dados design is not different from Anatal, ANAC, ANS, ANEL's model. What makes us think that that will be different than the behavior? There is a director indicated by the President of the Republic. Yes. Are they approved by the Federal Congress? Yes. Do they have a fixed term? Yes. Are they reimbursed by the government? Yes. Are they related to any other administrative agency? Yes, in all of them. Is there an advisory board? Yes, in all of them. But will them work differently from what we have? I understand that you see that from a different perspective, but the institutional environment in Brazil is a bit different. We are a federal republic, and according to the 24th article of the Federal Constitution, which guarantees to states if there is a subject, a company, an economic mean, there is consumerism, guaranteeing to municipalities the ability to administrate and legislate what is supposed to be local interest. And the Supreme Court acknowledges that and recognizes that as economic business. That's why we have to understand at what extent that may reach. And someone from the government will say, well, let's not give so much power to the government. I understand an institutional environment in different countries, but not here. Here we have a case of a ministry that wanted to invade the housekeeper account because that housekeeper was told to be caught in a prostitution episode. We have another case of someone who dealt with dollar, the American currency, and was buying some not legal CDs or something like that. He's speaking quite fast right now. And also he was selling data. So institutionality in Brazil, it operates different from other countries. This act obliges government but does not give any accountability to the public administration, accountability, data collection, and it's so real that they say give more power and they do not charge any accountability, because if an authority does not comply with the law, it gets a first penalty. Second, simple penalty. After that, the investigator may say that that person will stop acting. And who will dare saying that? Who would be penalty would be the citizens and not the public agent. So that does not guarantee accountability to the government. Where representatives from the civil society, they have the same abilities as the government has. With that, we may dilute corruption risks, we may dilute a lack of accountability, and some other federal governments. I understand your concerns, but the government array does not guarantee that in any of the branches. I don't think that Dados will be different from other agencies, and I don't think that institutional aspects will be different from what is happening. That is just wishful thinking.
Thank you, Tiago. Vinicius will have to leave early, and I want to make a final comment. I'd like to contribute somehow with what Tiago was saying. And we could perhaps agree that we'll have several examples of successful actions in terms of regulation. There is no single model, a silver bullet that will turn people who will create an autonomous independent agency out of the blue. There are specific characteristics which might encourage certain types of conducts or other types of conducts. And of course, we need to have a relationship with the regulated sector. That's important. The national system of consumer defense is a good example of that. It works as an agency linked to a ministry. Sometimes it works, sometimes not so much. I don't know whether or not it would be good to have an independent agency or not. It varies, but the fact remains that there are some characteristics that might encourage certain behaviors and limit or curb other behaviors. And an important point to emphasize here is the following. Sectorial regulating agencies, based on the collective action theory, they will be more capturable, if you will, than others. That's data, right? And why? Because we have concentrated interests or interested parties that are much more efficient in manifesting their desires. When I was at the Consumer Defense Department, it was normal to try to achieve sustainability of the sector it regulates. we do not want to see companies going bankrupt if you have a regulating agency. Think about a health plan company. If a health plan company goes bankrupt, it creates a big problem for the health regulating agency. Something went wrong. So it's only natural for federal agencies to seek some level of sustainability. The Data Protection Agency will have a somehow similar attitude when compared to other federal agencies. Well, in trying to attempt to reach strategies which are more geared towards providing guidance, providing guidelines, trying to help the agents get better structured, and on the other hand, a sanctioning power. And then an issue will arise a long time, and that model that contemplates an independent agency is important, and that will emerge and arise in any transversal regulatory approach, which is the need to discuss a negotiation agenda with the private sector. That's not contemplated in the bill yet, but we started at the CADE, the Consumer Defense Department, and we are now moving towards the regulating agencies, so that's bound to happen. We need to have a possibility to have the companies participate. They can come to us and say, we have this impact analysis report, we identified problems, and I'm here to report those problems to you as the agency. What kind of encouragement or incentives will there be for companies to do that? Of course, that agents will not have the ability to investigate everything and all things. So when you have to deal with different negotiation agendas, when you have to structure policies, implement policies, create rules to encourage the agents, the fact that you are a federal agency with a relatively good autonomy level, that makes a difference in coming across as a reliable counterpart at the negotiating table.
In my slides, which you have copy of, we talk a lot about this concept of constructive engagement, and this is very important. In data protection, this is even more important than any other regulation because the law is so gray and technology is so developing so fast that you continuously need to have this engagement between regulator and regulatees, regulated companies and the regulator. I want to give you an example of something that has been extremely successful now in the UK called regulatory sandbox. And I'm talking about this because to explain what kind of things your regulator, your data protection agency should be thinking about. Regulatory sandbox is a concept that is being picked up in the UK, Singapore, or Hong Kong to start with, but there may be more. It comes from financial services regulator, but it could be very useful for data protection. What this means is that in the financial services, there is a possibility for companies, for big banks and financial institutions to bring a product to the regulator and to test the product on the market. And these are really important economic, financial products, right? The derivatives and complex products. And to test it in a way which is outside the scope of the law, somewhat, potentially with some feedback from regulator, and they're also firewalled from any regulatory action until there is testing and learning and reiterating and making the product better. And this actually could work very well in data protection, because if you think about technology and startups, the way, to your point, the way they work is that they come up with a product and they don't think compliance. They are actually developing the product as they go. And in fact, it would be good to have that regulatory sandbox to allow for this reiterative compliance, feedback from consumers, feedback from regulators, and creating the better product and somewhat making firewalls from the legislation and from these big penalties, big fines. And so I'm just explaining and giving you this to tell you what kind of things we are going to be expecting. This is a really new, brave world in terms of how we regulate, how we oversee, and how we enforce law. It's not like anything we have seen before. So we have to be happy to jump in the cold swimming pool and to be able to swim. Yeah?
I agree with you, but Danilo, Vinicius, and others have said the difficulty of adapting those solutions. We know that we have a different law framework in the United Kingdom when compared to our law here. So work with the regulatory sandbox is very difficult for us. I'm participating in 3 work groups, banks, pension funds, to try to implement regulatory sandbox. And in the end, we have a new law, not a regulatory sandbox, because in Brazil, we need to have things in paper. We need to go through all the process, House, Senate, and so on and so forth. So the difficulty is big. Even though it's an elegant and interesting solution, I agree, but we have other spaces inside the government trying to implement regulatory sandbox, just as you described, and they are facing lots of problems. I understand it's an interesting solution, but it's difficult to have that in Brazil, coming from a country with a different legal framework. Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Danilo. And just for us to think that this debate about the authorities, no, not simple at all. It's very complex. It warrants all these discussions and negotiations. And of course, this debate is very worth our while, both in terms of structuring, in terms of setting up a model. It is a very challenging task. What I'd like to say is that, without a doubt, this discussion about data protection, when we think about a general law, about a general overarching regulation on data flows, which does not address a single sector as we had in Brazil, but which affects sectors across the board. And that's the main characteristic of a general law that dates back to decades ago. So both the model of the general law and the model of the independent authority, even though we're discussing this now in Brazil, this dates back to decades ago. Right, we know that. And I think we have had a chance to confirm that every day. There are areas, this data protection area involves very specific attributes that the authority needs to have. When I talk about those 3 pillars, I'm talking about those specific attributes. They needs to be able to require or request impact reports, international data flows. So we have a very wide array of different and complex attributes which need to have a specific model. So the idea of having an exclusive, centralized authority comes from that. So what we've been doing for the past years has shown that this model, challenging as it is, and imperfect as it may be, as it was outlined here, is what we have as the most solid, robust experience internationally. That's the first comment I'd like to make. A second comment, not only does it seem to be a more interesting and more robust model, if not with more qualities, but with fewer flaws, if I may, but for our institutional model, it's even more interesting. And why? Because in Brazil, when we think about the public prosecutor's office, and when we have over 400 consumer defense agencies, it's quite decentralized. We have public prosecutors' offices spread around Brazil with a high level of jurisprudence. In our case, we have the competence quite spread, diffused throughout the country. So in this case, it seems to me to be even more relevant for us to have a centralized authority. As Vinicio said, that might, of course, serve as an interlocutor to all different sectors, but it needs to centralize competencies and skills. Otherwise, we won't have the level of legal security that the state, the citizens, and the companies expect. So the model seems to be the most adequate to me. And for Brazil, as I said, it's even more relevant because of the specificity that we have of having so many players, so many actors at play in so many different environments, working with different general protection systems. The CADE experience, the Consumer Defense Department, is a case in point. They managed to build a set of competencies. They managed to build a good image, a good reputation to such an extent that they have a very good penetration with the public prosecutor's office. So when you have a credible agency, the authority is able to talk eye to eye with different actors, no matter how high in the federal hierarchy they are. So we need to consolidate that model in Brazil. Of course, aware of the problems, aware of the issues, but as it was said by Vinicius, if we think about all the other councils that we have, we know we have to think. Other words, when what we have, we need to compare with the challenges and problems and flaws that the other models also have. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Apparently, there won't be an extension in the voting of the law. That's the last piece of information. There won't be a delay in the deadline. No delay. Apparently. That's the last piece of news that I have. Just in. I'd like to thank Renato for the question and thank Renata for her patience, who's been waiting for 40 minutes to ask her question. Danilo, thank you. I don't want to make the question anymore. My question was for Tiago about authority, but I think he mentioned three different opinions. First, he said that the veto was because there was some lack of constitutionality in the bill, and we have opinions from former ministers saying that it is constitutional, so there is some controversy there. Our president, Mr. Temer, has already talked about that. So as the president of Brazil today, he will be consistent with what he wrote as an attorney before becoming a politician. But then you said that the problem was that the authority was something urgent, necessary, that we need to enact an authority immediately, that 1.5 year window would be a problem. And then you went on to other issues, other discussions, so we covered a lot of ground. So I confess I did not really understand your final position on the creation of the authority. If you could perhaps clarify that. And lastly, it's not a question, just a final comment, that law is being written or has been it's ongoing for many years. It started when the legal framework started being discussed. And we also have the law around intellectual property. When the legal framework was published, it did not anticipate covering all the topics. And I'm quite surprised that a government and administration should present so many barriers, so many possible vetoes to a project, to a bill, which went through so many public hearings, so many discussions. So as Congressman Silva said this morning, I would attribute that to a lack of knowledge about the bill. So if you could summarize the positions that you mentioned before, your position about authority, I thank you very much, because the debate was very interesting in the end. Tiago, just a second. There are two more questions, so I'd like to hear the questions so we could make the most of the time we have left.
Gente, acho que as perguntas meio que perderam. Eu ia fazer uma pergunta, mas acho que com os debates que aconteceram.
I was about to ask a question, but after all these debates, my question has already been answered, so no need to ask anything else, she says. I have a comment about authority. First, what is the topic? There is no closed official answer that the government would vet this part, this piece of authority, questioning legitimacy, democracy, the possibility of the society participating as the law states, but on the other hand is the possibility to have a partial veto of the project and immediately the addition of a government act outside that debate context, which happened for the past 9 years, including several sectors of the society, including the government, 576 from the legal ministry, justice. So the possibility of participation, it doesn't seem to be coherent to the presented alternative of a provisory amendment by the government with the videos of what has been said or shown in the total civil society. What worries me the most is to have those agencies such as a binge SI, where they have the role to perform personal data protection, which is quite worrisome because having public powers, those that collect sensitive data to surveillance an activity and to be in a competitive position to the private sector, quite unbalanced, to say the least.
E queria também fazer
I have another comment about Tiago's observation when he criticizes the possibility of auditing. And let me say that this possibility is part within the personal data protection scope, which will be regulated by a decree and which will define rules. Even in those agency models which were criticized by Tiago, even myself, I've got some criticisms about that, but we know that there is a legal process to allow that to happen. If we consider that we have an arbitrary environment or scenario with no rules, that is not what we foresee in the law. And last but not least important, I have several criticisms to agencies. I have been part of committees, Anatel twice. I participate for over 15 years at public hearings and so on and so forth. And we cannot expect within that context that just the public power will be accountable for that. The whole context demands an organization by the civil society. We have to question. There are legal instruments, public civil action, popular action, public hearings. There are several institutional drivers to allow civil society to promote social control, which has to be executed and conducted by all, especially by agencies with cooptation risks, which is not just a Brazilian privilege, that is worldwide. We know that regulated agents, they have the possibility to have a more assertive technical approach together with the agencies. And we from the civil society have managed to reach positive achievements. This is what we have for today, right? This is the model of agency which we have. And the suggestion of have a council with the penalty issues, I think that's quite difficult to be achieved. So these are my comments. And I would like to ask to Tiago if he believes that this alternative of that measure and to let others to have data control, if that would be a reasonable alternative and if that is mentioned within the government. Benefiting from our European guests, I apologize if that has been already addressed in previous panels today, but with the announcement of a data transaction between Japan and the European Union, PPC as an independent player, Personal Information Protection Commission, if I'm not wrong, he says. So maybe our European guests, colleagues could comment how relevant to the raise of such an important agreement about personal data, the importance of this authority. We are here reflecting upon the Brazilian scenario, but we have announced that in the international scenario as well. If some of you European guests could go on with that discussion, maybe. A importância do PPC.
On the future adequacy of Japan.
Well, it's very simple. Without that authority, there wouldn't have been any possibility for such a deal. When Danilo, you were asking about what are these elements of convergence. There are an overarching legislation, a set of enforceable rights, and an independent oversight or supervisory body. Those are elements of commonality, and it was because the Japanese decided to reform the legislation that we were then able to build on that convergence. Without that element, we would not have been able to reach the deal, which, as I reminded this morning, created the biggest area of free and safe data flows in the world. And that's exactly, it's that type of arrangement that I was mentioning before, and that we would like to explore with Brazil once there will be a law.
Thank you. Thiago?
O debate é muito legal, porque permite a gente estressar soluções.
I love debates and discussions, especially when we have opposite opinions. The most fun of all is when someone from the government side should say that the government should have less power to interfere in privacy, and third sector says exactly the opposite. And that becomes a value issue. As a policeman, I cannot get to anyone's house without any mandate. And the same applies to our issue, to our sector. So we have inverted values, legally speaking, that will go against privacy rights. Would be about the same as when you violate and get to someone's house. So, in fact, the legal approach is diverges from that. As to different positions, in fact, we do not have different positions, but rather different perspectives. First, there is an analysis of a technical team or a technical analysis, which still needs a veto, although they say the minister says that there is no inconstitutionality. We have incumbent ministers and some bills that were decided saying that they cannot penalty authorities, and that goes above my pay grade. That would require some more time. I'm not the one to decide about that. The technical committee believes so. That's why they placed that in the Constitution. With that in mind, we also analyze it. There are two ways. We have initiative, we have two ways to justify vetoes: inconstitutionality and also social interest. In that case, we have to analyze merit. And as to merit, inconstitutionality law relies on merit. And what seems to be more appropriate is to have inconstitutionality of data protection immediately to capture that 18 months window frame after vacatio legis. Usually, that law is appointed at the day of the disclosure. And when we say that law will just be approved 18 months later, that takes to 2020. There are people that are much more skilled to explain that. So there is efficacy without future approach. Well, I'm not fully skilled to answer it, but so far I haven't seen that. If we had an authority of data protection data, when that should just be approved by 2020, that would add to costs without being active. So I do not think that we should wait for 18 months. I rather would have a data protection authority right now. This is what we are suggesting. Do it now. Would that be democratic? I don't know. I am the guy who advocates that the government should not even be able to audit banks. GSA being, I don't know. I don't think so. And we see that and we speak out that in all forums. Our request is exactly the opposite, to have social participation. A public agent can just do it if it has a legal authorization. So the next public president will be able to appoint to anyone as long as there is a Congress approval. So let's make very clear. There is no discussion of a provisory amendment, because that would be a decree, administrative reorganization. So the temporary measure is to allow and to establish that data protection. But that is just a proposal. I wish the society as a whole should have a B plan, a backup plan. What sort of discussion are we going to have if no one proposes anything else? Well, I don't think that sounds as a good idea. That's why we have a new proposal, and I'm glad that happened. And we may have something else. Well, this is not the best act, the best bill. I'm talking about an authority which will have the power to audit the data bank of all Brazilian companies, all of them, 100% of companies with economic purpose, they have database. So we have to have a strong law, a real strong and good law, as that will affect the economy, Brazilians, citizens. So is that the best way to follow to damage those who live in certain level of poverty? How about that guy who has just a bar in the corner? Well, so they use personal data as economic means. So we have to appoint someone for data treatment. So we have too much on stake here. We should have more merit, and that should be our main focus. First of all, we would like to ask for panels with veto without temor, the president. Let me just reinforce that we have two clear conceptual mistakes. First, there is a mistake between government and data privacy. If you read good books about this topic and if you talk to experts, you will get that. But there is a global phenomenon in the Trump government, in the Brazilian government. The second one, as it is the rights as that has been designed in the Brazilian as well as in the European law, when there is a discriminatory effect in your life and they ask to have use of their data and they say, well, I cannot show you because if I show you, I can reveal industrial and commercial secrecy, then you can claim to authorities to eventually conduct an auditing process. So there is a misunderstanding in the concept and how that bill is interpreted. And that is not, it's under our control. It has been approved, the revision of the Brazilian rights introduction, which states three mandatory aspects. One, systematization of revenues, participative consultants before the decision, and third, impact decision, which will reinforce that toolbox. All elements will somehow help to better understand how the steering committee works. So we have some pillars that may help. So there is not much more to discuss. Everything is well solved. Scientific literature says that authority is not government. And I don't like to place the hat of the academy. What I'm saying is that Anatel is a regulatory agency, an independent one, is part of the indirect administration as well as data protection. If you believe that Anatel is independent of the government and all of those, that is a way of interpret it. Fine, fine by me. If you understand like that, it's up to you. So it's a different perspective. And as to auditing, the attributions of authorities for data protection, Article 56, to conduct auditings about personal data, including the public power. So that is a way to attribute responsibility to authorities. Those who had negotiated that text, they had goodwill. But what I'm concerned is how that will be used. Is that the type of power that we are going to give it to politicians? But I don't think that sounds very healthy. Well, our last comment to conclude this debate sharp at 9:00 p.m. and 1 minute. IBM.
Being very pragmatic now, we have a very strong link with compliance and that kind of thing. The law has not been approved, and we already have a group in place concerned about investigating every product to find out whether or not we are compliant, even before the law is passed. I'm not going to the merit of the constitutionality of the bill, but if right off the bat we are already discussing the constitutional quality of the bill, for people like us who are compliance obsessive, that generates legal insecurity. Let's assume the bill will pass, and then we'll have 18 months to elaborate impact reports, to analyze standard contractual clauses. Lots of costs will be generated because of that. After the 18 months, when we have the face administrative sanction, we'll run the risk of having to go to court because of that. For us, again, that represents a very high level of legal insecurity. I understand it would be very important for us to have a legal instrument that would grant or ensure legal security. If we insist on discussing legalese, all the views have been proposed, all takes have been shared. We need to move forward and seek for legal security for everyone across the board. Once again, thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this panel, the survivors, if I may, and our panel members. And I hope that on the 14th, no surprises emerge. Thank you very much.